Eleanor Whitman had given up on love 17 years ago. On the day she buried her young husband beneath the cottonwood tree behind their cabin. At 35, she was considered well past marrying age in Cedar Falls, Montana, a spinster who kept to herself and earned her living taking in, washing, and mending. The townspeople treated her with polite distance. She was respectable but pitied, useful but forgotten. She preferred it that way, or so she told herself each morning as she pinned wet clothes to the line behind her small house on the edge of town. Love had brought her nothing but heartache, and she'd learned to find contentment in simpler things. The satisfaction of clean laundry snapping in the wind, the quiet pleasure of a book by lamplight, the freedom to answer to no one but herself. But on this particular August evening, as storm clouds gathered over the Montana prairie and the first fat raindrops began to fall, Eleanor felt something stir within her that she'd thought was dead and buried along with her husband Thomas. The rain started gently, barely more than mist, but within minutes it became a proper downpour. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window watching it drum against the glass, remembering how she used to love storms when she was young, how she and Thomas would dance on their front porch during summer thunderstorms, laughing as the lightning lit up the sky. Without quite knowing why, Eleanor found herself opening her front door and stepping onto the porch. The rain was warm and sweet-smelling, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers from the prairie. For the first time in 17 years, she pulled the pins from her hair and let it fall loose around her shoulders, and then, as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten, Eleanor began to dance. She started slowly, swaying to the rhythm of the rain, her bare feet finding the familiar steps she'd shared with Thomas so long ago. The years seemed to fall away as she spun and turned, her simple gray dress growing heavy with water, her hair streaming behind her like a girl's. She didn't know that anyone was watching until she heard the sharp intake of breath from the road. Matthew Kane had been riding back to his ranch after a long day in town when the storm caught him. He'd taken shelter under the large oak tree that bordered Eleanor Whitman's property, tending to wait out the worst of the downpour. He knew Mrs. Whitman by reputation, the quiet widow who did washing for the townspeople, who kept to herself, and never caused trouble. But the woman dancing in the rain bore no resemblance to the prim, proper widow he'd occasionally glimpsed in town. This woman was wild and free, her movements fluid as water, her face tilted up to catch the rain. Her dark hair, which he'd only ever seen pinned severely back, now flowed loose and long down her back. In the flashes of lightning, he could see her smile, the first smile he'd ever seen on Eleanor Whitman's face. It transformed her completely. Matthew had been a widower himself for 5 years, since consumption took his wife Mary. At 42, he'd accepted that his chance for love and family had passed him by. He ran his cattle ranch with quiet efficiency, attended church on Sundays, and lived a life that was productive but empty of joy. But watching Eleanor dance in the rain, Matthew felt something awaken in his chest that he'd thought was gone forever. She was beautiful, not in the fresh-faced way of young girls, but with the deeper beauty of a woman who had lived and loved and survived. When she threw back her head and laughed at the sky, Matthew felt his heart skip like a schoolboy's. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, and Eleanor gradually slowed her dancing until she stood still in the sudden quiet, breathing hard, and looking startled by her own behavior. It was then that she noticed the rider under the oak tree. Even in the dim evening light, she recognized Matthew Kane. He was one of the more prosperous ranchers in the area, a man known for his fairness and quiet strength. Their paths had crossed occasionally in town, but they'd never spoken beyond polite greetings. Now he sat motionless on his horse, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized what he must have seen. She, a respectable widow of 35, dancing barefoot in the rain like some wild creature. The townspeople already whispered about her. This would give them enough gossip to last the winter. Excuse me," she stammered, backing toward her door. "I didn't realize anyone was ... "Don't apologize," Matthew said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "That was the most beautiful thing I've seen in years." Leonard stopped, her hand on the door handle, uncertain she'd heard him correctly. I should go, Matthew continued, touching the brim of his hat. But Mrs. Whitman, would you allow me to call on you sometime? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that Eleanor had stopped allowing herself to consider long ago. A respectable man wanting to call on her seemed impossible. I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Kane, she said finally. People would talk. Let them, Matthew replied. Good evening, Mrs. Whitman. He rode away, leaving Eleanor standing in her doorway with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. She told herself it was the storm that had unsettled her, the unexpected reminder of younger, happier days. It had nothing to do with the way Matthew Kane had looked at her, as if she were something precious and beautiful instead of a forgotten widow past her prime. But as she wrung out her wet dress and pinned up her hair, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the warmth in his voice when he'd called her dancing beautiful. 3 days later, Matthew appeared at her door, with his hat in his hands and a bouquet of wildflowers. Mrs. Whitman, he said formally, though his eyes were warm. I was hoping you might allow me to take you to church on Sunday. That is, if you don't already have arrangements. Eleanor stared at him, acutely aware of her work-worn hands and faded dress. Mr. Kane, I appreciate the gesture, but surely you understand. I'm not a young woman. People will wonder what you're thinking. I'm thinking, Matthew said carefully, that I've spent 5 years convincing myself I was content with loneliness. 3 nights ago, I realized I was lying to myself. Hey, Mr. Kane, Matthew, he corrected gently. I know what people will say, that I'm a fool for courting a woman past childbearing age. You're too old for romance, to set in your ways for marriage. But Eleanor May, I call you Eleanor? I don't care what they say. Elena's breath caught at the sound of her name on his lips. No one had spoken it with such tenderness since Thomas died. I don't know, she whispered. I haven't. It's been so long since you've allowed yourself to hope for something more than just getting through each day. His understanding pierced straight through her careful defenses. Yes, then let me hope for both of us, Matthew said. Just say you'll come to church with me one Sunday. We're seeing how it feels to have someone beside you again. Eleanor looked into his kind gray eyes and found herself nodding before her practical mind could object. Sunday. Morning arrived with unseasonable coolness. Eleanor changed clothes 3 times before settling on her best blue dress, the one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral and hadn't touched since. It still fit, though it was looser than it had been 17 years ago. When Matthew arrived with his buggy, he helped her up with such gentle courtesy that Eleanor felt like she was 17. Instead of 35, they rode to church in comfortable silence. Both aware of the stares and whispers their arrival would provoke, the reaction was everything Eleanor had feared and more. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they walked up the church steps together. Women leaned toward each other behind their fans, and men raised their eyebrows in speculation. Eleanor wanted to turn and run, but Matthew's steady presence beside her gave her courage. They sat together in the 3rd pew, and Eleanor was surprised to find that having someone beside her during the service felt natural rather than strange. When they stood to sing hymns, Matthew's rich baritone harmonized beautifully with her clear soprano, and Eleanor realized she'd forgotten how much she enjoyed singing. After the service, the reactions were mixed. Some of the older women, particularly those who'd known Eleanor before Thomas died, greeted her warmly and seemed genuinely happy to see her with a suitor. Others, especially the younger wives, looked disapproving, as if Eleanor's late-in-life romance somehow reflected poorly on their own marriages. Eleanor Whitman, said Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of Cedar Falls society. How ... surprising to see you with an escort. Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy, Eleanor replied evenly, though her cheeks burned. I must say, at your age, I suppose some women never give up hope. The comment was delivered with a smile, but the sting was unmistakable. Before Eleanor could respond, Matthew stepped closer to her side. Mrs. Abernathy, he said pleasantly, I consider myself the luckiest man in Cedar Falls to have Mrs. Whitman's company. A woman of her character and grace is rare at any age. Mrs. Abernathy's smile faltered, and she moved away without another word. Eleanor looked up at Matthew gratefully, but she could see the damage was done. The whispers were already starting. Over the following weeks, Matthew courted Eleanor with old-fashioned persistence. He brought her flowers from his ranch, invited her on buggy rides through the countryside, and spent long evenings on her front porch talking about everything and nothing. Slowly, carefully, he began to chip away at the walls she'd built around her heart. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. When he smiled at her, she felt beautiful for the first time in years. When he took her hand to help her from the buggy, the touch sent warmth racing through her entire body. When he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating woman in the world, she almost believed it might be true. But the town's reaction grew increasingly harsh. Shopkeepers became cold when she did her marketing. Women crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Whispers followed her everywhere, shameless, desperate, making a fool of herself at her age. The criticism hurt, but what hurt more were the comments about Matthew. People said he must be lonely and desperate to court such an old maid. They speculated about what he could possibly want with a barren widow when he could have his pick. Of younger women, Eleanor began to withdraw, canceling planned outings and making excuses when Matthew came to call. She couldn't bear the thought that she was damaging his reputation, making him the subject of ridicule and pity. Matthew noticed the change immediately. "Eleanor," he said one evening, as they sat on her porch, carefully maintaining the proper distance, that propriety required. "Been different lately. Distant. Have I done something to offend you?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "You've been nothing but kind. Too kind. What does that mean?" Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap, struggling to find the words. "Matthew, you're a good man. A respected man. You could have your choice of women in this territory, young women who could give you children, who could build a future with you. What could you possibly want with someone like me?" Matthew was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he was reconsidering his pursuit. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "When I was married to Mary, we tried for 10 years to have children. The doctor said it was me, that I would never father a child. Mary died believing she'd failed me, but the truth was, I'd failed her. So you see, Eleanor, I'm not looking for someone to give me children. That dream died with Mary." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. She'd assumed his childlessness was due to his wife's illness, not his own inability to father children. "I'm looking for," Matthew continued, "is someone to share whatever years I have left, someone to laugh with, to talk with, to dance with in the rain if she's so inclined. I'm looking for a companion, Eleanor. A partner, a love." "But the age difference? 7 years?" Matthew said dismissively. 7 years is nothing compared to 17 years of loneliness. "People are saying terrible things about you because of me," Eleanor whispered. "They think you're desperate or foolish or Eleanor." Matthew's voice was firm. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing the determination there. "I don't care what they say. I care about you. I care about the way you make me laugh. The way you listen when I talk about the ranch. The way you, when you think no one's listening. I care about the woman who dances in the rain because joy sometimes overcomes propriety." Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of believing this is real. Of letting myself hope again. Of losing someone I love, ... again." Matthew reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I can't promise you won't lose me someday, Eleanor. None of us know what tomorrow holds. But I can promise you this. For however long we have together, you'll never doubt that you're loved. Completely. Absolutely. Without reservation." The tears Eleanor had been fighting spilled over. "I don't know how to do this anymore. It's been so long since I was anyone's anything." "You don't have to know how," Matthew said softly. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time since his courtship began, Eleanor allowed herself to truly look at Matthew Kane not as a kind stranger offering companionship, but as a man who claimed to love her. She saw the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow both. She saw strength and gentleness, patience and passion carefully held in check, and she saw something else, hope, the same fragile, precious hope that was beginning to bloom in her own heart, despite all her efforts to prevent it. "The town will never accept this," she said quietly. "The town will adjust," Matthew replied. "Good people will come around and the others, well, their opinions never mattered much anyway. Mrs. Abernathy says I'm too old for romance. That I should be grateful for my quiet life and stop reaching for things that aren't meant for women my age." Matthew's jaw tightened. Mrs. Abernathy is a bitter woman who's never forgiven the world for not making her as important as she thinks she deserves to be. Don't let her poison what we have. "And what do we have exactly?" Eleanor asked, kneading. To hear him say it clearly, Matthew stood and moved to the porch railing, looking out at the prairie where the sun was setting in shades of gold and crimson. "We have a chance," he said. "Chance at happiness, at companionship, at love. We have the possibility of spending our remaining years together instead of alone. We have the opportunity to prove that love doesn't have an expiration date, that the heart doesn't stop wanting connection just because the calendar says we're past our prime." He turned back to her, his eyes intense. "We have the chance to dance in the rain together, Eleanor, literally and figuratively. The question is, are you brave enough to take it?" Eleanor stood and walked to join him at the railing, her shoulder almost touching his. The familiar landscape spread before them, rolling hills dotted with cattle, cottonwood trees marking the course of the creek, the endless sky that made everything else seem small and temporary. "I was brave once," she said quietly. "I was young and thought love was forever, when I believed in happy endings. What changed? Life, loss, the understanding that love can disappear in an instant, leaving you with nothing but memories. In regret?" Matthew nodded. "I know. When Mary died, I thought I was done with all of it. Love seemed like too big a risk, too much potential for pain. It was easier to focus on the ranch, on building something concrete and lasting, instead of risking my heart again." "What changed your mind?" Matthew smiled, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the warmth in his expression. "A woman dancing barefoot in the rain," he said simply. "A woman who reminded me that joy is worth the risk, that love, Evan, love that. Might be temporary is better than the certainty of loneliness." They stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Eleanor found herself thinking about the past few weeks, about how much brighter her days had become with Matthew's presence in them. She thought about going back to her old life of quiet solitude, of washing and mending and existing without truly living. The thought made her chest tight with panic. "Matthew," she said suddenly, if we were to continue this courtship, what would you want from me? What would you expect?" "I'd expect honesty," he said without hesitation. "I'd expect you to tell me when something's bothering you instead of withdrawing. I'd expect you to let me share your burdens instead of carrying them alone. And in return, I'd promise to love you exactly as you are. Not as you were 20 years ago, not as you might be in some imaginary future, but as you are right now. I'd promise to stand beside you against whatever criticism or gossip comes our way. And I'd promise to dance with you whenever you want to. The rain or sunshine, in the parlor or on the prairie." Eleanor turned to face him fully, studying his face in the dim light from her kitchen window. She saw no deception there, no hidden agenda or ulterior motive, just a man offering his heart to a woman he claimed to love. "People will say you're settling," she warned. "People said the same thing when I married Mary, because she was a school teacher instead of a rancher's daughter. People always have opinions about other people's choices. It's the only opinions that matter are ours." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff. Behind her lay the safe, familiar territory of spinsterhood and solitude. Ahead lay the unknown country of love and partnership, with all its potential for joy and heartbreak. "I need time," she said finally. "This is ... It's a big decision," of course, Matthew said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Take all the time you need." But as it turned out, Eleanor didn't have as much time as she thought. 2 days later, Mrs. Abernathy paid her a visit. Eleanor was hanging laundry when the banker's wife appeared at her gate, dressed in her finest day dress despite the heat. She stood watching Eleanor work for several minutes before speaking. Mrs. Whitman, I think it's time we had a frank conversation. Eleanor continued pinning clothespins to the line, though her hands had begun to shake slightly. Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy. What can I do for you? You can stop making a spectacle of yourself with Matthew Kane? The blunt words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play coy with me, Mrs. Abernathy snapped. The entire town is talking about your ... relationship. It's unseemly, Mrs. Whitman. A woman of your age carrying on like a schoolgirl, encouraging the attentions of a man who's clearly confused about what he wants. Eleanor set down the shirt she'd been hanging and turned to face her visitor. Mr. Kane seems quite clear about what he wants. Mr. Kane is a man, and men sometimes make poor decisions when they're lonely. But you, Mrs. Whitman, should know better. You should have the good sense to discourage his attention instead of parading around town on his arm like some desperate spinster. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Eleanor felt each one like a knife to her already fragile confidence. Furthermore, Mrs. Abernathy continued, sensing advantage. Your behavior is setting a terrible example for the younger women of our community. What kind of message does it send when a woman past her prime throws herself at the first man to show her attention? I haven't thrown myself at anyone, Eleanor said quietly. Haven't you? Dancing in your yard where anyone might see, accepting gifts and attention from a man you have no business encouraging, Mrs. Whitman. You're making yourself the laughingstock of Cedar Falls. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation. If people choose to gossip, that's their decision. It's gone beyond gossip, Mrs. Abernathy said sharply. The ladies of the church have been discussing your situation, and we're concerned. Concerned. For Mr. Kane, who's clearly not thinking clearly, and concerned for the moral tone of our community, what are you saying? Mrs. Abernathy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm saying it might be best if you made it clear to Mr. Kane that his attentions are no longer welcome. Surely you can see that this ... has gone far enough. Eleanor stared at the other woman, seeing the satisfaction in her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy was enjoying having the power to tear down something beautiful simply because she could. And if I don't, then you might find that your laundry business becomes less ... profitable. People talk, Mrs. Whitman. They share their opinions about who they choose to do business with. The threat was clear. Eleanor's livelihood depended on the good opinion of the town's women. Without their laundry and mending, she would have no way to support herself. I see, Eleanor said quietly. I'm glad you understand. This is really for the best, you know. Okay, a woman of your years should be content with her lot in life, not reaching for dreams that are better suited to younger women. After Mrs. Abernathy left, Eleanor sank onto her front steps and buried her face in her hands. The woman's words echoed in her mind. Too old, desperate, laughingstock past your prime. Each phrase felt like another nail in the coffin. Of her fragile hopes, maybe Mrs. Abernathy was right. Maybe she had been foolish to think that a man like Matthew could truly want someone like her. Maybe she had been reaching for something that wasn't meant for women her age. When Matthew arrived that evening for their usual visit, Eleanor was waiting for him on the porch, her face composed but distant. Eleanor, he said as he climbed the steps, you look upset. What's wrong? I've been thinking about what we discussed the other night, she said without preamble. About our ... situation. Matthew settled into the chair beside her, his expression growing cautious. And I think perhaps we should stop seeing each other. The words fell between them like stones. Matthew sat motionless for a long moment, his face unreadable. Why? He asked finally. Eleanor had prepared a dozen reasons, all of them logical and sensible. But under Matthew's steady gaze, the words seemed to desert her. It's just ... it's not working, she said weakly. What's not working? The way you smile when you see me coming? The way we talk for hours without running out of things to say? The way you lean into me when we walk together, as if you belong there? Matthew, please, Eleanor, what happened? 3 days ago you were beginning to open up to me, to trust what we have together. Today you're running away. Someone said something. To you, Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Who was it? Matthew's voice was dangerously quiet. It doesn't matter, it matters to me. Who told you that you're too old for love? Who convinced you that happiness is something you're not allowed to have? Eleanor's composure cracked. Everyone thinks it. The whole town is laughing at us, at me for thinking someone like you could. Want someone like me? They say I'm desperate, that I'm making a fool of myself, and you believe them. I don't know what to believe anymore. The words burst out of her, carrying 17 years of pain and loneliness. I don't know if this is real or if you're just ... If you just feel sorry for me, or if you're lonely enough to settle for anyone. Even an old widow with nothing to offer, Matthew stood abruptly and pulled Eleanor to her feet, his hands gentle, but firm on her shoulders. Eleanor, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, seeing something blazing there that made her breath catch. I love you, he said clearly, not because I feel sorry for you, not because I'm desperate or confused or settling. I love you because you're brave enough to dance in the rain, because you make me laugh, because you see beauty in simple things, because you've survived loss and heartbreak and still have the courage to risk your heart again. But I'm not brave, Eleanor whispered. I'm terrified. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what matters despite being scared. Matthew's hands moved to cup her face gently. Eleanor, I'm scared too. Scared of losing you. Scared of being hurt again. Scared that I'm not good enough to deserve a second chance at love. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life without you than I am of taking this risk. Eleanor searched his face, seeing nothing but sincerity and love. What if they're right? What if I am too old for this? Then we'll be too old together, Matthew said firmly. Eleanor, love doesn't have an age limit. The heart doesn't stop wanting companionship and affection. Just because you've passed some arbitrary number of years. What we have is real and precious and rare, and I'll be damned if I let small-minded gossips destroy it. Mrs. Abernathy threatened my business, Eleanor admitted. If I don't stop seeing you, she'll make sure the other women stop bringing me. They're washing. Matthew's jaw tightened. Then you'll come live at the ranch with me, as my wife, if you'll have me. Eleanor stared at him. Did you just propose, yes? Matthew dropped to one knee right there on her front porch, taking her hands in his. Eleanor Whitman, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a man who's not young anymore, but who loves you with everything he has? Will you dance in the rain with me for whatever years we have left? Eleanor looked down at this good, kind man, offering her his heart, his future, his name. She thought about Mrs. Abernathy's cruel words, about the town's disapproval, about all the reasons why this was impractical and inappropriate and destined for gossip. And then she thought about the alternative, going back to her quiet, safe, lonely existence, pinning up her hair and buttoning up her heart and pretending she didn't want more than mere survival. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, Matthew Kane, I'll marry you. Matthew surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed, the same wild, joyful laugh that had captivated him the night she danced in the rain. When? He asked, setting her down, but keeping his arms around her. Soon, Eleanor said breathlessly. Before I lose my nerve again? Tomorrow? Tomorrow? Eleanor smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had in 17 years. But Matthew ... There's going to be talk. Let them talk, Matthew said, and kissed her there on the porch for anyone who cared to see. The wedding took place the next afternoon in the small church, with only a handful of guests present. Some of Eleanor's oldest. Friends came, genuinely happy to see her find love again. A few of Matthew's fellow ranchers attended. Men who respected him enough to support his choice, regardless of their personal opinions. Mrs. Abernathy and her circle of followers were notably absent. But Eleanor found she didn't care, as she stood beside Matthew, speaking the words that bound them together. She felt only gratitude for the unexpected gift of second love. The ceremony was simple. But when Matthew kissed his bride, there was nothing simple about the joy that radiated from both their faces. Eleanor Whitman Kane was 35 years old, well past the age when most people expected romance and passion. But as she walked down the aisle on her new husband's arm, she looked like the happiest woman in the world. That evening, as they sat on the porch of Matthew's ranch house, her ranch house, now watching the sun set over the prairie, Eleanor finally understood what she'd been missing during her long years of careful solitude. "Do you regret it?" Matthew asked quietly, "giving up your independence, facing down the town gossips?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. She thought about Mrs. Abernathy's shocked face when she'd learned about the wedding, about the whispered conversations that would follow them for months to come, about the challenges of merging to established lives. "No," she said finally. "Regret the 17 years I spent being afraid to want more than just survival. I regret listening to people who thought they knew better than my own heart what I should want." Matthew laughed and stood, extending his hand to her with a courtly bow. "Mrs. Kane, would you do me the honor?" Eleanor kicked off her shoes and accepted his hand. Following him down into the yard where the rain was beginning to fall in earnest, they danced as they had that first night, wild and free and joyful, but together this time as partners in every sense of the word. As lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rolled across the prairie, Eleanor threw back her head and laughed at the pure happiness of it all. She was 35 years old, supposedly too old for romance, too old for passion, too old for the kind of love that made you dance barefoot in the rain. But as Matthew spun her around under the vast Montana sky, Eleanor knew the truth. Love had no expiration date. A heart that could break could also heal. And the soul that had learned to survive could also learn to soar. She had danced alone in the rain once, thinking she was saying goodbye to the part of herself that believed in love. Instead, she had been calling love back to her, beckoning it home across the prairie like a signal fire in the darkness.